And I know that I'm not alone in sometimes feeling that I wake up every morning saying, what the hell is going on? And I don't just mean politically, but on some deeper level, something is going on, and I don't know exactly what it is. We try at this show to kind of uncover little corners of it, shine lights in different places, but it's not easy. And my next guest has always helped me talk through some of these issues. You know her work. Marianne Williamson is the author of at least 12 books, and I would say at least 7 of them have probably been on the New York Times bestseller list. Probably at least 4 of them have been #1 bestsellers. She's appeared on so many programs. She's an author. She is a lecturer. She is an activist. And she joins us now. It's always a pleasure to talk to her. So first of all, Marianne, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Richard. It's always great to talk to you.
And listen, I want to start by saying, in the last several days, I feel as if this sort of this sort of up and down nature of my own reaction to the news has accelerated. You know, I personally was very excited about a couple of the progressive victories in the Democratic primaries. You know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defeating Joe Crowley, I thought was a refreshing change in many aspects. There was another victory in upstate New York. There are other shifts seeming to be going on that make me feel very positive. But then we had the Supreme Court rulings. We have this sort of sense of the fraying fabric of ourselves as a national community. And I do feel, as I said in my introduction to this segment, Marianne, as if there are deeper forces at work, and not only don't I understand what they are, I don't know how to move closer to understanding what they are. Does my question even make sense to you?
Well, it makes sense, but I think that we both know better. I don't think you're depressed because you don't know what's going on. I think we're all depressed because we do know what's going on. And I think you know what's going on. And you talk about it. And I think that it would be healthier for all of us to take in the sadness and the deeply sobering emotions that come with a deep understanding of what's going on. Everything that was happening the other day with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's victory is exactly what tried to happen with the Bernie campaign. And it's pretty horrifying to realize that that was the primary side of democracy's suppression, was, you know, within the Democratic Party in the 2016 election. And that went the way it went. We had a perfect storm. And now people like you, people like me, people like those watching your show know exactly what's happening. We are in the beginning phases of an effort at what amounts to a kind of fascist takeover, certainly an extreme right-wing takeover of the U.S. government. We can stop pretending we don't know what's going on, because we do know what's going on. And it's just, you know, I wish that we had language other than war language, but to the extent to which war language is applicable, it's like World War II or any major war. There are going to be some good days and going to be some bad days. We're going to win some battles and we're going to lose some. But the issue is what's going to happen in the larger struggle. Now, within the larger narrative of American history, we have tended over time to do the right thing. We had slavery, but then we had abolition. We had the suppression of women's rights to any kind of ownership, even the right to vote. And then we had waves of feminism and suffrage. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, and then we had the civil rights movement. This is just the latest iteration. This is the latest coming back around again. This is the latest return of a force in human consciousness, often played out in human affairs, deeply anti-democratic, deeply dominating, oppressive. This is not something new. And it's not only nothing new in human history, but it's nothing new in the history of the United States. The issue is for this generation to jump out, to exit any level of naivete, either about what's happening now or what's happened in our past, so that we can have a clearer vision of what's happening and a clearer vision of what we are being challenged. to do now, what we are being called to rise up to within ourselves and within the political domain. We're not the first generation to have to deal with some deeply undemocratic forces. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back on track. We have swerved from fundamentals of our democracy. American capitalism has obviously swerved from its ethical center, and it's our job to get this country back on track. I do think that there are conservatives as well as liberals who are as concerned about authoritarianism as any of us are. So we need to avoid seeing this as a left-right conservative liberal thing. There's something deeper than that and darker than that going on right now. And but like I said, let's not pretend we don't know what's going on.
Well, that sounds right to me, and it feels right to me. I had this, the historian on Timothy Snyder, who wrote the book on tyranny and other books, talking about the dangers that we face now on the sort of tyranny to freedom scale, which is an oversimplified way of putting it, as you know. But and I said to him, I think he had 12 points to look out for, and I said that, maybe 7, 8, 9 of those are flashing red now, but even in what I would say are the better periods of recent history, maybe 5 of them were flashing yellow or red. It seems to me that, and so what you say makes a lot of sense to me, that this isn't anything new, that somehow as we struggle, one of the things I'm concerned about is that I see people around me sometimes who their anxiety and their fear and their anger, much of which I share, is obvious from my introduction, that can divorce us from the historical context, and we see ourselves just in isolation from each other, isolation from the future and the past, and we just kind of panic. And it seems to me grounding ourselves is really important. So how do we ground ourselves without diminishing the importance of the moment, if you know what I'm trying to say? We
grow up. It takes a lot of deep personal maturity to be able to endure times like these, and most importantly, to transform times like these. I say to audiences all the time, we don't have time for you to finish your trauma work before you show up for your country. You think the people who were walking across the bridge at Selma were not traumatized? You think those women who were being force-fed in prison, who were the suffragettes, were not in anxiety? This is not a time to be prissy. As Martin Luther King said, we must have tough minds and tender hearts. Immature people who are so enamored of our own woundedness that we can't get out of our own narcissistic perspective on this. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. That is not the level of personal maturity that will enable us to move through these times. And that's why I mentioned before, it's time for us to just face what's happening. This is very serious, but let's not pretend it's not happening. And let's not indulge our own self-centered trauma. Of course we're all anxious. If you're looking at what's happening in America today and you're not depressed, who are you? Of course we're all depressed by this. Of course we're all very concerned, as we should be. But I think when you realize that and you sit within that space, then you find the quality of personhood you were talking that we need. You were talking before about how every day it's up and down, up and down. Once we really inhabit the space of, number one, recognizing what's happening, and number two, surrendering ourselves in service to our country and to really the human race, that we will move through these times and even arrive at something better, delivers us to a place where we don't get all childishly up and down on any given day. Yeah, today some good things happen. That doesn't mean that the problem is over, and today some bad things happen, and it doesn't mean the good shall not prevail. We need to not waste our energy indulging too much immediate what's happening in the football game right now, and keep our eyes on the larger prize. Like, you look at what's happening right now with Kennedy's having resigned, and the fact that McConnell, who said that Obama was not going to be able to appoint a Supreme Court justice, even though he had 200 and some odd days left in his presidency. But now McConnell is saying that they will have a hearing on the replacement appointed by Trump, even though this Congress only has 130 some odd days. Well, on one hand, that's outrageous, and it makes you want to go, ah! I think a deeper realization is, of course, that's what McConnell said. That's what happens in a situation like this. And somehow, when you withdraw your forces, your emotional forces, from the immediate freak out, and just really allow yourself to see, number one, how unsurprising it is that McConnell is saying that, but number two, what this really means for democracy, that McConnell is saying that, then it makes us more fierce in a more concentrated way. And I think then we can all be far more focused on doing what each of us has to do in order to face this moment and to make it clear to McConnell and anyone else that this kind of craziness will not stand. We have acquiesced, we have appeased. I think going all the way back, the thing that keeps coming up for me, Richard, is the 2000 election. I think that was when it's kind of a toe opened the door and it was pretty easy. Certain forces went, well, that was easy, let's just keep going. As soon as we so easily gave in on that one, when the Constitution says that the states are in charge of their vote, so the Supreme Court of Florida says they're going to do a recount, and then talk about judicial activism. The Supreme Court of the United States said, no, we're not going to. And then we all got pretty quiet. I think about that moment and wondering if we should have been so quiet. I remember asking Al Gore when I interviewed him on the radio once, why didn't we protest then? He said, well, I said, you didn't support that. Jesse Jackson said we should all go to Washington. You said no. He said, well, I didn't want to be responsible for blood. I didn't want to be responsible for violence. I said, what if it had been a nonviolent protest? At the very least, I think there should have been a more mature recognition that a process was already undertaken that could only spell danger for our democracy.
You know, and the tragic irony there, Marianne Williamson, is that out of, you know, an arguably noble desire to avoid bloodshed on Al Gore's part, we got the war in Iraq as the consequence of...
Well, and you point there, this is really the issue of our moment. How do we resist, but resist nonviolently? That is the deep emotional and psychological issue of this moment. How to nonviolently, but fiercely own your no and own your yes. And that is why, you know, these are deep spiritual issues. There's nothing holy about complacency, and there's nothing unspiritual or negative about yelling fire if in fact the house is burning down. And our democracy is like a house that is burning down right now. So it's on fire. And we must take every possible bucket of water, and we must say no to the arsons. We must. But we must do so nonviolently. Gandhi said the end is inherent in the means. Everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. You know, we have to look deep inside ourselves. I don't know if this applies to anyone who's watching your show, but we do have to face the fact that only, 54% of Americans even voted in the last election. We allowed this to happen. We allowed this to happen. I mean, I'm looking right now at, you know, all these reports about Kennedy's retirement and how what this is really going to represent, and Trump knows this, is a shift in the question on Roe v. Wade, because he will try to appoint someone who would be open to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Well, a lot of young American women, they don't remember the struggle. They don't remember what it took to get here. And they don't remember a time when abortions were illegal. They don't remember a time when women were dying, you know, in back alleys with, you know, coat hangers up their vaginas. They don't remember a time when rich women got safe abortions and poor women got unsafe abortions. So they've just taken it for granted. And I think about a lot of young women I know who didn't vote, who said, oh, you know, I'm not into politics, or you can't get me to vote my fear. I'm going to vote the one who really stands, you know, without a serious recognition of what it would mean if someone like a Donald Trump got the opportunity to appoint Supreme Court justices. Now, I'm not in any way pointing my finger and pinpointing young women at all, I'm just saying that's an example of a part of the population that I think is going through this activation right now of realizing that so much of what we had taken for granted, we did so unwisely.
You know, when you say, that we need to act nonviolently, as I've learned from you and others, nonviolence isn't just a matter of not hitting somebody or attacking somebody, but it's a state of mind. And it seems to me that sometimes we go into our battles with nonviolence of action, but not nonviolence of spirit. And I think you know what I mean by that. But just to be clear, meaning that we're furious and we're rageful. I appreciated what you had to say about McConnell and McConnell's comments. To me, what I was thinking as you were saying it was, instead of just saying, this is so unfair, that son of a bitch, he's doing it again, to kind of respond by saying, okay, in the words of the rock band The Clash, this is the call up. Okay, here we are again, being called. When he says something like that, when Trump says something, whatever he's likely to say next or tweet next, that, okay, once again, that's the call up. That's your signal that you have work to do. And in a nonviolent way, meaning not distracted by your own sense of rage or victimization, or the world isn't being unfair to me and my friends, my allies, my tribe of people in my party or whatever, but just, okay, that is your assignment from the universe. That there's another reminder that today, what did you do today to change the situation? What did you make a phone call? Did you make a small contribution? Did you write a letter? What did you go to a protest? What did you do today to make a difference?
Absolutely. And I think that we need to think in terms of not just small acts right now. We need to think in terms of big acts. We have elections in November that could not be more important. So it's not a small, it might be a small contribution financially, but none of us should be making small contributions in terms of our own personal efforts. If you have a Twitter page, if you have a Facebook page, if you have an Instagram, you have a platform. I think for a lot of us, it means facing down our resistance, even bringing up certain topics. I think that there are a lot of relationships and social situations today where it's not appreciated when we speak a certain way, and sometimes looking at ourselves, at our own unwillingness to face the disapproval of people when we speak up. I think that that's probably less for men than it is for women. I was reading a study that said for a woman to feel confident to express her opinion, she has to feel 80% sure of her facts. And for a man to feel confident of sharing his opinion, he has to feel 20% sure of his facts. I think sometimes women don't speak as much as our opinions as much as we might because we don't have all the facts. So I think right now part of the work is reading up on these issues and being educated. Even like what you said I mentioned about McConnell. Well, I read an article and I knew how many, it was 200 and some odd days for Obama left in his presidency, and it's only 100 and some odd days left for this Congress. One of the steps in nonviolence is educating ourselves. I think a lot of times Americans right now look at racism and look at bigotry and look at the fact that hatred has been harnessed for political purposes. We know that's wrong. We know that's wrong. And we know that that's not who we should be as a nation. But we have, because of a failure of the American education system, lack of education, miseducation, or our own distraction for whatever reason, we can't necessarily articulate what this country should be. Too many Americans don't really know the first principles of the United States as articulated in our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution. They're not really clear about the profundity and the meaning of all men are created equal, and what it means that that was a repudiation of an aristocratic system, and that therefore, because that's a first principle, that we repudiate corporatocracy and plutocracy and oligarchy, because that means only a few people get the power, which is in direct contradiction to all men are created equal. That God gave all men inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. e pluribus unum, that we out of many we would be one, that we would have religious freedom, that we would be many ethnicities, many cultures, many everything. You could be this sex, this color, this religion, that religion. Spread your wings, do whatever you want, and as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, you get to do that in America. That's the American dream. So I think too many Americans are in what amount to an immature state, where, like you see with little children, where they just have a temper tantrum because they don't have the words yet to say what it is they want to say. Too many of us know how to articulate, we don't want this, but don't know how enough to articulate what America is supposed to stand for. So I think a lot of people would do very well to read some books, whether it has to do with things about the founding of this country or founders of this country or any of the things that clue us into a more intelligent conversation, not only about what is happening, but what should be happening. You mentioned Tim Snyder. He's certainly an example. All of the articles that you write, the work that you do, Richard. I mean, this is a time, I think, for us to be very intellectually engaged in the history of the United States and what is happening now. It's very difficult to understand what's happening in a novel if you just pick it up in the middle. You know, you have to know what happened before, or you won't know the plot, and you won't know who the characters are. And so I think this is a time for a real holistic paradigm of healing our society that will involve the mind, involves the intellect, as well as the spirit, as well as the soul, as well as the psyche, as well as our hearts.
You know, that's very helpful. And Marianne Williamson, you know, when we bring up the soul and spirit, I know a lot of people, including a lot of my listeners, are uncomfortable with the language of the spirit, and I'm okay with that. You know, I get that that's not part of everyone's idiom, but it is a reflection of, in my belief, it's a reflection of the totality of what it means to be a human being. Whatever language you use to describe it, whether you use the language of God or, you know, or other words and other metaphors, that I feel as if we've become somehow estranged from a certain dimension of ourselves, and I feel that it's all interconnected. I feel that that broader view means recognizing that we evolved from one-celled animals and learned to walk upright, and then, you know, sometimes cooperated as hunter-gatherers and sometimes fought. It involves all of that. It involves that grasp of history that you're talking about, but it also involves a level of comfort with things unseen. And I'm trying to figure out whether there's a way. It certainly infuses everything I do. I know it infuses everything you do, as is obvious from your work. But you've taught so many people in that area. But I'm wondering if it even matters to bring that back into left discourse.
It matters if you want political power. I think we need to challenge the over-secularization of the conversation of the American left. I think we need to challenge the corporatized, over-secularized, morally neutral conversation of the American left. It's like, how's that working for you? And it's relatively new. Bobby Kennedy talked about how this was a contest for the soul of America. John Kennedy said it won't help us to be materially rich if we're spiritually poor. Obviously, Martin Luther King, the great progressive champion of social justice of the 20th century, was a Baptist preacher. So this idea that we should keep it so secular, keep the conversation, is in direct contradiction to any kind of alignment with the American heart. 90% of the American people say they believe in God. And people are hardwired for connection to a higher power. And we are hardwired for connection to some level of allegiance to tribe. So if you don't give people a valid conversation about spirit, guess what? They take the ersatz version. You don't give people a valid conversation around patriotism, guess what? They go with a counterfeit conversation. So this idea that we're somehow, almost people act like they're intellectually superior because they're keeping the conversation. Not if people want to keep their conversation completely secularized, they have every right to do that. But this idea of dismissing those of us who don't has actually diminished the power of the left. I remember when there was a religious left in America. Now, the separation of church and state is a completely different story. That is an enlightened principle that both protects government from religious interference and protects religion from governmental interference. But this wasn't the founders trying to suppress the spiritual conversation. It was the founders seeking to protect it and to liberate it. So this apologizing on the left, unless you're in an African-American churches have never divided the political from the religious conversation. But in white America, not only have we divided it, but we make an apology for the fact that we even want to go there. And that is, I think we should face the fact that that's why a lot of Americans have thought that the left was kind of anti-God, because the left acts like it's like too hip to use the M word. Well, in the past, in American history, the left stood for moral values every bit as much as the right did. It's just that we had a concentration and a focus on public moral issues. Economic justice is a moral issue. We should see mass incarceration and criminal injustice as a moral issue. Now, the left is rediscovering this because we're seeing things like what's happening at the border with these children as a moral issue. But for a long time, the left had a problem contextualizing things such as invading a country that hadn't done anything to you should be seen as a moral issue. So I'm tired of any kind of apologizing to people who have done, or to forces that have done so much to lose political power on the left because of this conceit that somehow we're too smart to go there. If they don't want to go there, fine. But they don't get to claim the ground for the entire left side of the American political spectrum that we don't talk about God or spirit. Basically, people should talk about these issues however they want to talk about them without being worried about demeaning from anybody, much less people on their own side. I mean, this is crazy. This is why the left is called a circular firing squad.
Right. And, I mean, I was always raised to believe in tolerance and acceptance. And, it's interesting. I know so many super moral, ethical, beautiful non-believers. But the professional class, the sort of new atheist class, I was very early, I'll give myself credit for this, in calling warning signs on the likes of Sam Harris, for example, who has gone on to advocate mass invasions and nuclear bombing of Islamic capitals, torture of Muslims, Christopher Hitchens advocating for the war in Iraq and other wars, Richard Dawkins repeating, sort of casually racist and sexist slurs and so on. And I'm not saying that non-belief means that you have to turn out that way, but there is sort of an ideology that is connected with the class and foreign policy system we're trying to defeat. And I think it's worth challenging that, and I'm glad it's being challenged both by folks like you and by folks like Reverend Barber and others by example. And by the way, it reminds me, I've got in front of me one of my favorite Marianne Williamson lines, because it's just so Marianne, in my opinion. It's from Healing the Soul of America. God is merciful, and I know some people aren't comfortable with the language. God, that's okay. God is merciful. I do not believe he is angry, but he's not kidding either. I really like that line.
The idea there is referring to the law of cause and effect, which in the East is called the law of karma. Everything you do comes back at you. So if that's true for an individual, you can say it in very secular terms. You can say everything goes around comes around. Well, the point here is if that's true for an individual, then it's true for a collective. And if that's true for America, then God help us. That's no different than Thomas Jefferson saying, I tremble for my country when I consider God as just and that his justice shall not sleep forever.
Yeah, which is a quote I've not hesitated to use myself. And I guess, as a kind of closing thought, there are people who say, well, I don't like self-help stuff. And I'm in recovery programs, so I'm comfortable with what is misdefined inaccurately defined in my opinion as self-help, because as those communities understand, and is I think embedded in all of your work, Marianne, is the notion that healing, recovery, whatever you want to call it, spiritual advancement, all of those things are both individual and collective processes, and that we cannot heal as individuals without healing as a broader community.
Well, years ago, there was a shift in the way people saw the treatment, psychological, emotional treatment of children, disturbed children. And people began to realize that parents couldn't just drop off their upset child with a therapist and say, fix my kid, because the therapist would say, no, you have to address the entire family unit. What are the psychological and emotional dynamics going on in the entire family? The child cannot heal separate from the entire family unit. Now it's time for us to realize that this applies to the larger society. There's a limit to how healed and whole you can be in the midst of a totally ill society. And so once you realize that all that a nation is a collection of individuals, then you realize that the same psychological processes that apply to healing the individual heal the whole collective. Psychotherapy in the last 100 years has done a great disservice of focusing on the individual circumstances. You go to your therapist and say, I'm upset, I'm depressed, and the therapist says, well, what's going on in your life? Well, it's not just what's going on in your life that might be upsetting you today. It's what's going on in this country. It's what's going on in this world. Someone told me the other day, she went to therapy the other day. She started talking about how upsetting everything is in America today. And the therapist said to her, oh, don't even get started. And I'm like, you can't get started there. Where are you supposed to get started? I also believe, Richard, that everybody should talk however they want in America without feeling that other people should tell us how we shouldn't talk. Some people should talk in religious terms. Some people talk in non-religious terms. Some people talk in spiritual. If you don't like self-help, don't do self-help. Now, I think, having said that, we do have a tradition in this country that I think all of us need to respect, and that is within political conversation, specifically political conversation. We do have a tradition of keeping the language secular. I think that is extremely important. The religionization of politics is not healthy here or anywhere. But that's a slightly different issue than just what's happening when we're discussing the issues at large. I also think this whole concept of self-help is funny to me, because deep spiritual healing is not self-help. Deep spiritual healing recognizes you're the problem, you're not the answer. The small self is the problem. The realization of something larger than ourself is the answer.
Well, I think that is a perfect moment on which to end. So I'm going to leave it right there. Marianne Williamson, as always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
It's always great to talk to you, and thank you for everything that you do, Richard, not just for me, but for all of us.